When Margaret Hartwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach at what she thought was Creek Ranch, the cowboys burst into laughter until the widowed rancher Daniel Crawford emerged from his house, took one look at the lost woman clutching her worn satchel, and whispered, "I've been praying for this moment." But would a case of mistaken identity become the answer to both their prayers? Or would the dangerous men trying to steal Daniel's land destroy their chance at happiness before it even began? The stagecoach wheels hit a rock so hard that Margaret Hartwell's teeth rattled like dice in a cup. Dust clouds swirled around the wooden coach as it bounced down the dirt road through the Texas heat of 1,867. Her fingers gripped the torn leather seat while her stomach churned with each bump and jolt. "Creek Ranch coming up," the driver shouted from his perch above. His voice cracked like a whip through the summer air. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. This was their last chance to start over. The war had taken everything from her family's farm in Georgia. Her brother died fighting at a place called Gettysburg, and without him, the bank took their land. She'd been working odd jobs for 3 years, saving every penny for this moment. The coach lurched to a stop so suddenly that Margaret nearly fell forward. Through the small window, she saw a simple ranch house with peeling white paint. Chickens pecked in the dusty yard, and the smell of hay drifted on the hot breeze. "Here's your stop, miss," the driver called down. His weathered face showed concern as he helped her climb down. "You sure this is the right place? Don't look like they're expecting company." Margaret smoothed her faded blue dress and tried to hide the shake in her hands. "I'm expected. Thank you for the ride." The driver tipped his hat and climbed back up. "Safe travels, miss. Stage comes back through tomorrow if you need it." As the coach rolled away, Margaret stood alone in the yard. The house looked smaller than she'd imagined from the newspaper advertisement. Through a window, she could see the shadow of a man bent over papers at a desk. She walked toward the front door, her worn boots crunching on the gravel. Each step felt heavy, like walking through thick mud. This job had to work out she'd spent her last dollar on the stage fare. Before she could knock, the door swung open. A tall man with kind eyes and silver streaks in his dark hair stood in the doorway. He wore a simple work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, showing arms tanned by years of sun and hard work. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was gentle but puzzled. Margaret straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. I've come about the housekeeper position." The man's eyebrows drew together in a frown. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mix-up. I'm Daniel Crawford, and I didn't put any advertisement in the papers for—" "Creek Ranch," Margaret interrupted, pulling the crumpled newspaper clipping from her small bag. Her hands shook as she held it out. "Room, board, and $20 every month. I have the advertisement right here." Daniel took the paper and studied it carefully. His frown deepened as he read. "Miss Hartwell, I'm afraid you've made a mistake. This is the Double Creek Ranch. The creek ranch you're looking for belongs to the Meadows family. They live about 5 miles south of here." Margaret's face burned with shame. Heat crept up her neck and spread across her cheeks like spilled paint. Behind Daniel, she noticed a woman's shawl hanging on a chair and a delicate teacup sitting on the fireplace mantel. Of course, he was married. She'd made herself look like a fool. I'm very sorry for bothering you, Mr. Crawford. I'll be on my way right now." She turned to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Miss Hartwell, wait just a minute." Margaret paused at the wooden gate, her pride fighting with the practical voice in her head. The sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and she had no money left for a room even if she could find one. Daniel walked up beside her, his boots making soft sounds on the gravel. "I know this might seem strange, but you're welcome to stay the night." "My wife," he stopped, and his voice caught like a branch snagging on cloth. "My wife died 6 months ago, but she always insisted on offering help to travelers in need." Margaret looked at his face and saw the sadness that lived in his eyes like shadows in a deep well. "I wouldn't want to cause you any trouble, Mr. Crawford." "You wouldn't be causing any trouble at all. Truth is, the house has been too quiet lately." He glanced at the setting sun. "Besides, it's not safe for a woman to travel these roads alone after dark. Too many drifters and cattle thieves moving through the area." Margaret weighed her choices, like coins in her palm. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. The thought of spending the night outdoors with dangerous men roaming the countryside made her skin crawl. If you're absolutely sure, it's no trouble. None at all. I was just about to start making supper. Daniel's smile changed his whole face, making him look younger and less worn down by grief. Nothing fancy, mind you. Just beans and cornbread. As they walked back toward the house, Margaret caught the sweet smell of wild roses growing along the fence. For the first time in months, the tight knot of worry in her chest began to loosen just a little. The inside of Daniel's house felt like stepping into a different world. Margaret had expected chaos, dirty dishes stacked high, clothes scattered everywhere, the kind of mess that came from a man living alone. Instead, she found a small but tidy space with everything in its proper place. Daniel moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, lighting the fire in the stove and setting 2 plates on the wooden table. Margaret watched him handle the delicate china with careful hands, as if each piece was made of spun glass. "These plates are beautiful," she said, running her finger along the gold rim of her cup. "They belong to Elizabeth, my wife." Daniel's voice grew soft, like he was talking in church. Her grandmother carried them all the way from Virginia in a wooden crate. Elizabeth always said they made even the plainest meal feel special. Margaret studied his face as he spooned beans into the bowls. She could see the love and loss written in every line around his eyes. "How long were you married?" 8 years come September. We built this place together, board by board." He paused, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "We planned to fill it with children someday." Seems God had different ideas. The weight of his loneliness settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret knew that feeling, the hollow ache of dreams that would never come true. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. Daniel nodded and seemed to shake off his sadness. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Hartwell. What brings you all the way to Texas?" Margaret hesitated. She'd learned to be careful about sharing her stories, and people looked at her differently when they learned she'd lost everything. But something about Daniel's honest face made her want to tell the truth. "I lost my family's farm in Georgia after the war ended. My brother Tom was killed at Gettysburg, and without him to help work the land." She shrugged, trying to make it sound less painful than it was. "I've been taking whatever work I could find ever since. Teaching children, sewing clothes, keeping house for families." The advertisement for Creek Ranch seemed like a chance to settle down somewhere permanent. "And you traveled all this way by yourself?" "I didn't have much choice. A woman alone doesn't have many options in this world." Daniel studied her face in the flickering lamplight. "You're braver than most men I know, Miss Hartwell." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. When was the last time someone had called her brave instead of foolish or reckless? "Please, call me Margaret. Only if you call me Daniel. We're not exactly strangers anymore." As they ate, Margaret found herself stealing glances at Daniel's hands. They were strong and scarred from years of hard work, but gentle when he poured her coffee or passed her the cornbread. She wondered what it would feel like to have someone care for her with such quiet kindness. "The stage should come back through tomorrow morning," Daniel said, breaking into her thoughts. Margaret nodded, trying to ignore the unexpected pang of disappointment in her chest. "I should gather my things and be ready." "Margaret," Daniel said suddenly, his voice uncertain, "what if things don't work out at the Creek Ranch? What if the Meadows family has already found someone else?" Margaret looked up from her plate. "I suppose I'll have to find something else. I always do." "I was wondering." Daniel stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Would you consider staying here instead?" "As my housekeeper, I mean. I know it's not what you planned, but I could offer you the same wages as the Meadows family, $20 a month, plus room and board." Margaret's heart skipped like a stone on water. "Daniel, I couldn't possibly." "Please, just think about it." His eyes were earnest, almost pleading. "This house needs a woman's touch, and I could use the company. It gets mighty lonely out here." Margaret set down her fork, her mind racing. She'd come to Texas looking for work, but she'd never expected to find someone who might actually want her around for more than just her cleaning skills. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. Margaret looked around the small kitchen, imagining herself cooking meals here, tending a garden, maybe even hanging new curtains in the windows. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. I'll think about it, she promised. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she'd ever made. Margaret's eyes snapped open to the sound of roosters crowing like they were announcing the end of the world. Sunlight poured through the gingham curtains of the small bedroom, warming her face and chasing away the last bits of sleep. She'd slept better than she had in months on the narrow bed, wrapped in quilts that smelled like lavender and home. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the thin walls, making her stomach rumble with hunger. She dressed quickly in her blue dress, braiding her hair and pinning it up the way her mother had taught her years ago. In the mirror above the simple dresser, she noticed a small vase of dried wildflowers. Elizabeth's touch, she realized, still bringing beauty to this room months after her death. When Margaret stepped into the kitchen, she found Daniel already at the stove, his hair still damp from washing at the pump outside. He wore clean clothes and had shaved, making him look younger in the morning light. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "I hope the roosters didn't wake you too early." "Not at all. You didn't need to cook breakfast for me. My mama would box my ears if she knew I let a guest go hungry." He gestured toward the table with his spatula. "Besides, it's nice to have someone to cook for again. Gets tiresome making meals for one." As they ate, Margaret found herself watching the way Daniel moved confident and sure, but never rushed. His hands were steady as he poured her coffee, and she noticed a thin white scar running across his knuckles. "How did you hurt your hand?" she asked. Daniel looked down at the scar and chuckled. "Building the barn 3 years back. Hammer slipped and caught me good." Elizabeth fussed over it for weeks, changing the bandages every day. His expression grew soft with memory. She said a man's hands were his most important tools, and I better take care of them. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You remind me of her in some ways. Got that same fire in your eyes." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a warning." "Definitely a compliment." The sound of wheels crunching on gravel made them both look toward the window. A dusty stagecoach was rolling up to the house, the same one that had brought Margaret here yesterday. "Right on time," Daniel said, but his voice had lost some of its warmth. Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. She'd spent half the night thinking about Daniel's offer, weighing it against her original plan. The Creek Ranch job was what she'd come for, what she'd planned and saved for. But sitting here in this cozy kitchen, watching Daniel's face in the morning light, she felt torn between duty and desire. "I should get my bag," she said, standing up. "Margaret, wait." Daniel stood too, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I meant what I said last night. The offer stands, if you want it." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart skip hope mixed with fear, like he was afraid she might disappear if he blinked too hard. "I know you did. And I need to see this through. I made a promise to myself to check on this job." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand. But if things don't work out, I'll know where to find you." 15 minutes later, Margaret sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat as they rolled toward the Creek Ranch. The morning air was cool against her face, and meadowlarks sang from the fence posts along the road. Daniel kept the horses at an easy pace, like he wasn't in any hurry to reach their destination. "Tell me about the Meadows family," Margaret said. "They're good people, hard workers. Mr. Meadows raises cattle and horses, and Mrs. Meadows keeps a fine garden." Daniel paused. "They've got 5 children, though. All under the age of 12. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. 5 children? The advertisement didn't mention children. Might have forgotten to include that detail. Daniel's mouth twitched like he was trying not to smile. "Little Billy is 8 and has a talent for finding trouble. The twins are 6 and never stop moving. Mary is 4 and cries whenever strangers look at her. And baby Samuel is just learning to walk, which means he's into everything. Margaret's confidence began to wobble like a loose wheel. That's quite a handful. They've been through 3 housekeepers in the past 6 months. 3? Margaret turned to stare at Daniel. What happened to them? First one quit after Billy put a frog in her bed. Second one left when the twins painted the kitchen walls with mud. Third one packed up and ran off in the middle of the night after baby Samuel somehow got hold of her best dress and used it to clean the chicken coop. Margaret felt her stomach drop to her boots. And you're just telling me this now? Daniel's grin was full of mischief. Didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. Besides, you said you were brave. I said I'd survive the war, not that I was ready to battle an army of small children. Children can't be that much harder than Georgia farm work, can they? Margaret gave him a look that could have melted iron. You've never tried to keep 5 children clean, fed, and out of trouble while cooking 3 meals a day and washing clothes, have you? Well, no. Then you have no idea what you're talking about. They rode in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds, the clip-clop of horse hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Margaret's mind raced with second thoughts. Maybe she should tell Daniel to turn around right now. Maybe she should take his offer and save herself the headache. But then she remembered the long journey from Georgia, all the money she'd spent on stage fare, all the planning and hoping she'd done. She couldn't give up before she even tried. There it is, Daniel said, pointing ahead. The Creek Ranch sprawled across a green valley dotted with oak trees. The main house was twice the size of Daniel's, with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. Cattle grazed in the pastures, and smoke rose from the chimney. As they drew closer, Margaret could hear shouting coming from inside the house. Not angry shouting, more like the sound of children running wild. A crash echoed across the yard, followed by a woman's voice raised in frustration. Sounds like they're having a lively morning, Daniel observed. Margaret squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. Well, I didn't come all this way to turn tail and run at the first sign of trouble. That's the spirit. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch. Want me to wait out here? Margaret considered this. Having Daniel nearby would make her feel braver, but it might also make it harder to focus on the job at hand. Give me an hour, she said. If I'm not back by then, I'll come looking for you with a search party. Margaret laughed despite her nerves. It can't be that bad. As if summoned by her words, a small boy with dirt-streaked cheeks appeared around the corner of the house, chasing a squealing pig with a wooden stick. Behind him ran a woman in a flour-dusted apron, her hair escaping from its pins. Billy Meadows, you put that pig back in its pen this instant, the woman shouted. The boy grinned and kept running. The pig escaped toward the barn, and the woman stopped in the middle of the yard, hands on her hips, looking like she might cry or scream or both. That's when she noticed Margaret and Daniel sitting in the wagon. Oh my goodness, the woman said, smoothing her apron and trying to tuck her hair back into place. You must be Miss Hartwell. I'm Ruth Meadows. Welcome to Creek Ranch. Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs suddenly feeling like wet noodles. Thank you, Mrs. Meadows. I'm here about the housekeeper position. Mrs. Meadows glanced at the barn where Billy was still chasing the pig, then back at Margaret. Well, I suppose we should talk inside. Fair warning, though, it's been one of those days. Margaret looked back at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then she followed Mrs. Meadows toward the house, wondering if she was walking into the adventure of a lifetime or the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Billy tied baby Samuel to the kitchen chair with ribbon this morning, Mrs. Meadows explained as they walked toward the house. Her voice carried the tired edge of a woman who'd been fighting small battles all day. Said he was playing cowboy and needed to tie up the cattle rustler. Margaret's steps slowed. Through the front windows, she could see small faces pressed against the glass, watching her approach like she was some kind of circus performer coming to town. And Samuel didn't mind being tied up? Oh, he loved it. Giggled the whole time. It's getting him untied, that's the problem. Billy used about 20 different knots. Mrs. Meadows pushed open the front door, and the sound of chaos spilled out like water from a broken dam. The inside of the Creek Ranch house was beautiful, but looked like a tornado had swept through it. Toys scattered across the polished wooden floors, muddy footprints tracked from room to room, and something that might have been breakfast was smeared across the dining room table. In the kitchen, Margaret found baby Samuel still tied to a chair, but he was clapping his hands and babbling happily at the ribbons. Two identical girls, with tangled blonde hair, were having a sword fight with wooden spoons, sending flour flying everywhere. A little girl with pigtails sat in the corner, crying because her doll was missing its head. "Mary, stop crying. Lucy and Lily, put those spoons down right now," Mrs. Meadows said in a voice that suggested she'd been repeating these words all morning. The twins ignored her completely. Mary cried louder. Baby Samuel started chanting, "Ba ba ba," and banging his feet against the chair legs. "Where's your husband?" Margaret asked, raising her voice over the noise. "Out checking the cattle with our oldest boy, Jake. He's 15 and more help with the ranch work than with the children." Mrs. Meadows untied one of Samuel's ribbon bonds and immediately had to catch him as he tried to climb out of the chair. "Jake's a good boy, but he'd rather work with horses than watch his brothers and sisters." Margaret watched the twins knock over a tin of salt with their spoon fight. The white crystals scattered across the floor like snow, and both girls immediately started trying to sweep it up with their hands, making the mess 3 times worse. "How long has it been since your last housekeeper left?" 2 weeks ago. Martha was a sweet girl, but she wasn't prepared for children this lively. Mrs. Meadows bounced Samuel on her hip while trying to separate the twins. "We can offer $15 a month, room and board included. You'd have your own small bedroom off the kitchen, and Sundays free after church." $15 was 5 less than Daniel had offered, and Margaret could already see why 3 women had quit this job. But she'd come here for a reason, and she wasn't the type to give up without trying. "What would my duties include?" "Cooking 3 meals a day, keeping the house clean, helping with laundry, and watching the children when I need to help my husband with ranch work." Mrs. Meadows paused as Billy burst through the back door, his shirt torn and his face streaked with mud. "Billy, what happened to your clothes?" "The pig didn't want to go back in its pen," Billy announced proudly, "but I got him there. Had to wrestle him a little bit." "You wrestled a pig?" Margaret asked. Billy grinned, showing a gap where his front tooth used to be. "Sure did. I'm going to be a real cowboy someday, so I need to practice with ornery animals." One of the twins, Lucy or Lily, Margaret couldn't tell which, tugged on her skirt. "Are you going to be our new housekeeper lady?" "I might be. What happened to the last housekeeper lady?" "She ran away," the other twin said matter-of-factly. "Mama said she wasn't tough enough for our family." Mrs. Meadows' face turned red. "Girls, that's not exactly what I said." "You said she couldn't handle children with spirit," Billy corrected. "I heard you telling Papa." Margaret looked around the chaotic kitchen, then at Mrs. Meadows' tired face. Despite the mess and noise, she could see love in this family. The children weren't mean or cruel, just energetic and creative in ways that drove adults to distraction. "Mrs. Meadows, might I have a word with you privately?" "Of course, children. Stay in the kitchen and don't touch anything." Mrs. Meadows led Margaret onto the front porch, where Daniel was waiting patiently in the wagon. "I can see why your housekeepers have had challenges," Margaret said carefully. "They're good children, Miss Hartwell, just active. Their father and I work hard to keep the ranch running, and sometimes we need help managing them all." Margaret glanced back through the window, where Billy was now trying to teach baby Samuel how to march like a soldier. "What happened to their mothers before you? I mean, how did you manage 5 children while doing all this work?" Mrs. Meadows' expression grew sad. "We lost 2 babies before Billy was born. Then God blessed us with these 5 in quick succession. My mother lived with us until last year, but she passed away from pneumonia. That's when we realized we needed help. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Mama was wonderful with the children. She had endless patience and energy." Mrs. Meadows looked out at the cattle grazing in the distance. "I keep hoping to find someone with her same gift for managing little ones." Margaret considered this. She'd helped raise her younger cousins back in Georgia before the war, but 5 children at once was different. Still, she'd survived losing everything and starting over. How hard could it be? "I'd like to try the position," she said finally. Mrs. Meadows' face lit up with relief. "Really? Even after seeing all this?" "Children need structure and kindness," not fear. I think we could work something out. Wonderful. When can you start? Margaret glanced at Daniel, who was pretending to study his horse's harnesses, but was clearly listening to every word. I could start tomorrow morning, if that works for you. Perfect. Let me show you your room, and we can discuss the specific details. As they walked back into the house, Margaret caught Daniel's eye through the window. He touched the brim of his hat and gave her a small nod, proud of her for being brave enough to try, even if it meant she wouldn't be coming back to his ranch. The bedroom Mrs. Meadows showed her was small but clean, with a window overlooking the garden and a comfortable-looking bed covered in a patchwork quilt. It wasn't fancy, but it would do. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6, Mrs. Meadows explained. The children usually nap after lunch, which gives you time to catch up on other work. Laundry day is Monday, and we go to church in town every Sunday. Margaret nodded, making mental notes. What about discipline? How do you handle it when the children misbehave? We don't believe in harsh punishment, but we do expect respect and obedience. Extra chores for repeated misbehavior, early bedtime for defiance, that sort of thing. This sounded reasonable to Margaret. And your husband, what's his role with the children? He helps with discipline and spends time with them in the evenings, but most of the day-to-day care falls to me. And now to you, I hope. They walked back to the kitchen, where Billy had convinced the twins to help him build a fort out of chairs and tablecloths. Baby Samuel sat in the middle of their creation, clapping and giggling. Mary had stopped crying and was playing with her headless doll, having apparently decided it was just as good without its original parts. This actually looks like fun, Margaret admitted. Mrs. Meadows smiled for the first time since Margaret had arrived. They're creative, I'll give them that. Sometimes their creativity just gets a little overwhelming. Margaret watched Billy explain to his sisters how to properly construct fort walls. Despite the chaos, she could see the intelligence and leadership in his young face. These weren't bad children, they were just children who needed the right kind of guidance. I think we're going to get along just fine, Margaret said. But as she spoke the words, she couldn't help wondering if she was making the right choice, and why the thought of Daniel driving away without her made her chest feel tight with regret. Margaret woke up to the sound of something crashing downstairs, followed by Billy's voice shouting, "It wasn't me this time!" She bolted upright in the narrow bed, her heart racing as she remembered where she was. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her room at Creek Ranch, and the smell of smoke drifted up from the kitchen below. She threw on her dress and rushed downstairs to find chaos waiting for her. The twins stood in the middle of the kitchen, covered head to toe in flour and molasses, while baby Samuel sat on the floor eating what looked like raw biscuit dough. Mary was crying in the corner because her shoes were missing, and Billy was trying to fan smoke away from the stove with a dish towel. "What happened here?" Margaret asked, surveying the disaster. "We wanted to make breakfast for Mama and Papa," Lucy announced proudly, flour in her hair making her look like a tiny ghost. "As a surprise," Lily added, molasses dripping from her chin. Mrs. Meadows appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "I overslept," she said weakly. "I never oversleep." Margaret rolled up her sleeves. This was exactly the kind of challenge she'd faced back home when her cousins visited too many children, too much energy, and not enough adults to keep track of everything. "Billy, open those windows to clear the smoke. Lucy and Lily, go wash your hands and faces at the pump outside. Mary, check under your bed for your shoes. Mrs. Meadows, you sit right there and don't move." To her surprise, all the children obeyed immediately. Even baby Samuel stopped eating the raw dough and looked at her with wide, curious eyes. "How did you do that?" Mrs. Meadows asked in wonder. "Children like knowing what's expected of them," Margaret explained, rescuing a pan of half-burned biscuits from the stove. "They were trying to help, not cause trouble. We just need to give them better ways to help." She spent the next hour teaching Billy how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, showing the twins how to set the table properly, and letting Mary help measure flour for fresh biscuits. Baby Samuel sat in his high chair, banging a wooden spoon against a pot and providing music for their work. By the time Mr. Meadows came in from the morning chores, breakfast was ready and the kitchen was clean. He was a tall, quiet man, with calloused hands and kind eyes that reminded Margaret of her father. "Well, I'll be," he said, looking around the tidy kitchen. "Ruth, did you hire a magician instead of a housekeeper?" "Better than a magician," Mrs. Meadows replied, spooning scrambled eggs onto his plate. "Someone who actually understands children." Margaret felt a warm glow of pride at the compliment. Maybe this job wouldn't be as impossible as she'd first thought. But her confidence wavered when Jake, the 15-year-old, slouched into the kitchen with mud on his boots and a scowl on his face. He was tall like his father, but had the lanky awkwardness of a boy who'd grown too fast. His brown hair stuck up in all directions, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. "Jake, this is Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Meadows said. "She's our new housekeeper." Jake barely glanced at Margaret. "Another one? How long before this one runs away screaming?" "Jake," Mr. Meadows' voice carried a warning. "What?" "I'm just being honest. We've scared off 3 housekeepers already. Why should this one be any different?" Margaret studied the teenager's face and saw more than just rudeness. She saw hurt and disappointment. This boy had watched 3 women come and go, probably believing each time that maybe this one would stay and care about his family. "You were right to be suspicious," she said calmly, surprising everyone at the table. "I might not work out either, but I'm going to try my best while I'm here." Jake looked at her for the first time, his expression uncertain. "Yeah, well, we'll see." After breakfast, Mrs. Meadows showed Margaret around the rest of the house. It was larger than Daniel's place, with 6 bedrooms, a parlor, and even a small library filled with books. But it needed work dust on the furniture, clothes scattered in bedrooms, and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. "I know it looks overwhelming," Mrs. Meadows said, apologetically. "It's not so bad. Just needs organization and routine." Margaret opened a window to let in fresh air. "How did you manage before you had housekeepers?" "Barely. My mother was a wonderful help, but after she died..." Mrs. Meadows trailed off, her eyes growing sad. "I suppose I hoped someone else could step in and fill that role." Margaret understood. Mrs. Meadows wasn't just looking for someone to clean and cook, she was looking for someone to help hold her family together. "Mrs. Meadows, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you want me here because you need help, or because you're hoping I'll replace your mother?" Mrs. Meadows was quiet for a long moment. Then she sank onto the sofa and put her face in her hands. "I don't know anymore. I just feel so tired all the time, like I'm drowning and can't catch my breath." Margaret sat beside her. Being a mother to 5 children while helping run a ranch would exhaust anyone. "But I can't be your mother, and I can't be the children's grandmother. I can only be myself." "And who is that?" Margaret considered the question. "Someone who believes children deserve kindness and consistency. Someone who thinks a home should be a place where people feel safe and loved. Someone who's not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Meadows looked up, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "That sounds like exactly what we need." But even as Margaret spoke the words, her mind drifted to Daniel's quiet house and the gentle way he'd offered her a place in his life. She pushed the thought away she'd made her choice, and she needed to give it a fair chance. Later that afternoon, while the younger children napped and Mrs. Meadows worked in the garden, Margaret found Jake in the barn. He was mucking out stalls with angry, jerky movements that suggested he was working off frustration. "Need any help?" she asked. Jake glanced up, sweat beading on his forehead. "You don't look dressed for barn work." "I grew up on a farm. I know which end of a pitchfork to hold." Despite himself, Jake's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Fine, you can help with the hay." They worked in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds, the rustle of hay and the gentle nickering of horses. Margaret could feel Jake stealing glances at her, as if he was trying to figure her out. "Why did you really come here?" he asked finally. "I needed work." So did the other 3 housekeepers. But they left. Margaret leaned on her pitchfork. "What do you think I should know about your family that your parents haven't told me?" Jake considered this. Billy's not just energetics, too smart for his own good. He gets bored, and then he finds ways to entertain himself that usually end in disaster. The twins worship him and copy everything he does. Mary's shy because everyone always focuses on the troublemakers and ignores her. And baby Samuel. Jake paused. He's the easiest one, but Mama worries about him constantly because we lost 2 babies before Billy was born. Margaret nodded. And what about you? What about me? You're part of this family too. What should I know about you? Jake's movements slowed. I'm old enough to help Papa with the real ranch work, but young enough that Mama still treats me like one of the little kids sometimes. I want to be useful, but I also... He stopped, his face reddening. You also what? I miss Grandma. She was the only one who understood that I'm not a little kid anymore, but I'm not a grown man yet either. Margaret felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. That's a hard place to be. Yeah, well, it is what it is. They finished their work as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Margaret of the view from Daniel's porch. She wondered what he was doing right now, whether he was eating supper alone at his small table. Miss Hartwell? Jake's voice interrupted her thoughts. Yes? Thanks for not treating me like a baby. The other housekeepers always talked to me like I was Billy's age. Margaret smiled. You're welcome. And Jake, I think you're going to be a big help to me if I'm going to figure out how to manage this family. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jake smiled back, a real smile that transformed his whole face and made him look like the boy he still was underneath all that grown-up responsibility. Maybe this job would work out after all, but as Margaret walked back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was waiting for her elsewhere, and she might be missing it by staying here. 3 days later, Margaret stood in the Creek Ranch kitchen at dawn, flour dusting her apron as she rolled out biscuit dough. The house was finally quiet, all 5 children still asleep upstairs, and Mr. and Mrs. Meadows not yet stirring. This peaceful hour before sunrise had become her favorite time of day, when she could think and plan without small voices demanding her attention. She'd fallen into a routine faster than she'd expected. Billy responded well to having important jobs to do, like feeding the chickens and gathering eggs. The twins thrived when they could work together on projects like sorting buttons or folding napkins. Mary bloomed when given one-on-one attention, and baby Samuel was content as long as someone was singing to him while he played. But something felt wrong, and Margaret couldn't put her finger on what it was. The kitchen door creaked open, and Jake shuffled in, his hair sticking up and his eyes still heavy with sleep. You're up early, Margaret said softly. Couldn't sleep. Papa wants me to ride out to check the north pasture today. Says some of our cattle might have wandered onto the neighbor's land. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Margaret always kept ready. We've been having problems with our boundaries lately. What kind of problems? Jake hesitated, glancing toward the stairs to make sure his parents weren't coming down. There's been talk in town about a man named Morrison who's been trying to buy up all the small ranches in the area. Papa thinks he might be causing trouble for folks who won't sell. Margaret's hands stilled on the biscuit dough. What kind of trouble? Cattle going missing, wells getting fouled, fences cut. Jake's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Some folks think Morrison's trying to force people to sell by making it too expensive to keep ranching. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Has he approached your father about selling? Not yet, but Papa says it's only a matter of time. Before Margaret could ask more questions, the sound of horses approaching the house made them both look toward the window. Through the early morning mist, she could see 3 riders coming up the lane at a steady pace. That's odd, Jake said, setting down his coffee cup. Who'd be visiting this early? Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the window for a better look. The lead rider was a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, and something about the way he sat his horse made her stomach clench with worry. Jake, go wake your father. Now. The urgency in her voice sent Jake running for the stairs without argument. Margaret watched the riders approach, noting the way they spread out as they neared the house-a-knot, like friends coming to visit, but like men planning something. Mr. Meadows appeared in the kitchen still pulling on his shirt, with Jake close behind. He looked out the window and his face went pale. Ruth, he called upstairs, keep the children in their rooms. Who are they, Papa? Jake asked. Jake Morrison and his men, just like I was afraid of. Mr. Meadows reached for the rifle that hung above the kitchen door. Margaret, I want you to go upstairs with Ruth and the children. I'm not leaving you to face 3 men alone, Margaret said firmly. This isn't your fight. It is now. This is my home too. Mr. Meadows looked at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. All right then, but stay behind me. The 3 of them walked out onto the front porch as the riders came to a stop in the yard. The man with the scar, Morrison, Margaret assumed, dismounted with easy confidence. His clothes were expensive but practical, and he wore his gun like a man who knew how to use it. Meadows, Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. Nice morning for a ride. It was. What brings you to my land, Morrison? Just thought I'd stop by and see if you'd reconsidered my offer. Morrison's eye swept over the house and barn like he was already calculating their value. Ranching's getting more dangerous these days. Lot of accidents happening to folks who try to go it alone. Margaret felt Jake tense beside her. The boy's hands were clenched into fists, and she could see him struggling not to say something that might make the situation worse. I told you before, my ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Meadows replied evenly. That's a shame. Real shame. Morrison's gaze moved to Margaret, and she felt her skin crawl under his cold stare. New housekeeper? Pretty thing. Hope she doesn't get hurt in any accidents. The threat in his words was clear as a church bell. Margaret stepped forward before she could stop herself, her chin lifting in defiance. Are you threatening this family, Mr. Morrison? Morrison's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Threatening? No, miss. Just concerned for your safety. This is dangerous country for folks who don't have proper protection. We can protect ourselves just fine, Jake said hotly. One of Morrison's men, a thin man with mean eyes, laughed. Boy thinks he's tough. Might want to teach him some manners, Morrison. Now, Morrison said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. No need for unpleasantness, yet. He remounted his horse and gathered the reins. Think about what I said, Meadows. Winter's coming, and a lot can happen to a ranch when the snow gets deep. Hate to see anything happen to your family. The 3 men rode away as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving the Meadows family standing on the porch in tense silence. Papa, we should ride to town and tell the sheriff, Jake said. Mr. Meadows shook his head grimly. Sheriff Bradley's a good man, but Morrison's careful not to do anything that can be proven in court. It's our word against his. So we just wait for him to make good on his threats? Margaret asked. We take precautions. Keep the rifle loaded. Don't go anywhere alone, and hope he decides we're more trouble than we're worth. But even as Mr. Meadows spoke the words, Margaret could see in his eyes that he didn't really believe Morrison would give up that easily. Later that morning, while the children played in the yard under Jake's watchful eye, Margaret found herself thinking about Daniel. Had Morrison approached him too? Was he facing the same threats alone in his small house? The thought of Daniel dealing with men like Morrison by himself made her chest tight with worry. She tried to push the feeling away. She'd made her choice to work for the Meadows family, and she needed to focus on keeping them safe. But as she watched Billy teach baby Samuel how to stack blocks, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere else, someone she cared about, might be in danger. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure there was anything she could do about it. Mrs. Meadows appeared beside her, wiping her hands on her apron after finishing the breakfast dishes. You're thinking about something serious, Mrs. Meadows observed. Just worried about what Morrison might do next. That's not all you're thinking about, is it? Margaret glanced at her employer, surprised by the woman's perceptive tone. What do you mean? I mean, you've been looking toward the road that leads to the Double Creek Ranch ever since those men left, and you've been quiet in a way that suggests your mind is somewhere else entirely. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm just concerned about the neighbors. If Morrison's threatening you, he might be threatening others too. Mrs. Meadows studied her face carefully. Margaret, is there something you need to tell me about Mr. Crawford? The direct question caught Margaret off guard. She opened her mouth to deny it, then realized she was tired of pretending her feelings didn't exist. He offered me a job too, she admitted quietly. The same wages you're paying, but at his ranch. And you chose us instead? I came here for this job. It seemed like the right thing to do. Mrs. Meadows was quiet for a long moment, watching her children play in the yard. The right thing to do? Or the safe thing to do? What's the difference? Sometimes doing what's right requires taking a risk. Sometimes the safe choice isn't the right choice at all. Margaret looked at Mrs. Meadows in confusion. Are you suggesting I should leave? I'm suggesting that a woman who would stand up to Jake Morrison to protect a family she's known for 3 days might be brave enough to admit when her heart is telling her something important. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of another horse approaching made them both turn toward the road. This time, it was a single rider coming at a full gallop, and Margaret's heart jumped when she recognized the horse. It was Daniel's mare, but the man riding her wasn't Daniel. The stranger riding Daniel's horse pulled up short in the yard, his face streaked with sweat and dust like he'd been riding hard for miles. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized him, Tom Bradley, the sheriff's youngest deputy and Daniel's nearest neighbor. "Miss Hartwell," Tom called out, swinging down from the saddle. "Thank God I found you. Daniel Crawford's been hurt." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret gripped the porch railing so hard her knuckles went white. How badly? Bad enough. His barn caught fire last night, and when he tried to save his horses, a burning beam fell on his leg. Tom's words came out in a rush. "Doc Peterson's with him now, but Daniel keeps asking for you. Says he needs to tell you something important." Mrs. Meadows stepped closer, her face full of concern. "Is he going to be all right?" "Don't know yet. The leg's broken, and there might be other injuries. Doc won't know for sure until the swelling goes down." Tom turned back to Margaret. "Will you come? I've got a fresh horse ready for you." Margaret's mind raced. Daniel was hurt and asking for her. But she had responsibilities here, children who needed her, a job she'd committed to just days ago. "Margaret, go," Mrs. Meadows said firmly, reading her thoughts. "Jake can help me with the children for 1 day. But what if Morrison comes back? What if—" "We'll manage. Right now your friend needs you more than we do." Margaret looked at the children playing in the yard, then at Mrs. Meadows' kind face. 3 days ago, she'd chosen duty over her heart. But standing here now, with the news that Daniel might be seriously hurt, she realized some choices mattered more than others. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she promised. "Take as long as you need," Mrs. Meadows replied softly. 15 minutes later, Margaret was riding behind Tom on a sturdy bay mare, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. The morning sun climbed higher as they raced across the Texas countryside, and every mile felt like an eternity. "Tell me exactly what happened," Margaret called over the sound of galloping. "Fire started around midnight. Daniel thinks someone set it deliberately, found signs that coal oil had been poured around the base of the barn. Tom urged his horse faster. He managed to get 3 horses out before the roof started falling. That's when the beam caught him." "Morrison," Margaret said grimly. "That's what Daniel thinks too. But proving it's another matter entirely." They crested a hill, and Margaret could see the Double Creek Ranch spread out below them. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight. Where Daniel's neat barn had stood, only blackened timber and smoking ruins remained. The smell of burned wood and hay hung heavy in the air, and ash drifted across the yard like gray snow. Daniel's house looked small and vulnerable without the barn beside it, and Margaret felt a fierce surge of anger at whoever had done this. This was more than destroying property. This was an attack on everything Daniel had built with his own hands. Tom led her straight to the house, where Doc Peterson's buggy sat in the yard. The elderly doctor emerged as they dismounted, his sleeves rolled up and his face grim. "How is he?" Margaret asked immediately. "Stubborn as a mule, and twice as ornery," Doc Peterson replied, but his eyes were kind. "The leg's broken clean through, and he's got some burns on his hands and arms, but he'll heal, given time and rest." "Can I see him?" "He's been asking for you every 5 minutes since I got here. Maybe you can convince him to drink the laudanum I brought for the pain. He refuses to take it until he's talked to you." Margaret hurried into the house, her heart clenching at what she found. Daniel lay on his bed, his left leg splinted and bandaged, his hands wrapped in white cloth. His face was pale beneath the soot stains, and his dark hair was singed short on one side. "Margaret." His voice was hoarse from smoke, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You came." "Of course I came." She pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, fighting the urge to take his bandaged hand. "How are you feeling?" like I got trampled by a herd of cattle. But I'm alive, thanks to you. Thanks to me? Daniel? I wasn't even here. But you taught me something important. Daniel struggled to sit up higher against his pillows. You showed me that sometimes taking a risk on someone unexpected can change everything. So when I heard those horses approaching last night, instead of just grabbing my rifle, I also turned the horses loose in the back pasture first. Margaret's eyes widened. You knew it was Morrison? Had a feeling. He came by 2 days ago with the same offer he probably made to the Meadows family. When I refused to sell, he made it clear that accidents might start happening. Daniel's jaw tightened. Guess he was a man of his word. Daniel, this is my fault. If I'd stayed here instead of going to Creek Ranch, maybe I could have helped, or... Stop right there. Daniel's voice was firm despite his injuries. This isn't your fault. This is Morrison's doing, pure and simple. But Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Margaret leaned closer, noting the serious tone in his voice. Morrison's not just trying to drive out individual ranchers. Tom's been asking questions around town, and it turns out Morrison's got backing from some big cattle company back east. They want to control all the grazing land and water rights in this whole valley. How many ranchers has he approached? Near as we can tell, every small operation within 20 miles. Some have already sold and moved on. Others, like the Hendersons and the Martinez family, are holding out. But Morrison's getting more desperate, which means more dangerous. Margaret felt cold, despite the warm morning air. What does this mean for the Meadows family? It means they're in more danger than they know. And so are you, as long as you're working for them. Daniel reached for her hand with his uninjured fingers. Margaret, I know you feel obligated to honor your commitment to them, but I'm asking you to come back here. Not just because I want you to, but because I'm worried about what Morrison might do next. I can't just abandon them. They have 5 children, Daniel. I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking you to think about what's really best for everyone involved. Daniel's eyes were intense despite his pain. If Morrison's plan succeeds, the Meadows family will lose their ranch anyway. But if we can find a way to stop him, how do we stop a man with enough money to buy off half the county? Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see him thinking through possibilities despite his obvious discomfort. The same way David stopped Goliath, he said finally. We find his weakness and hit it hard. What weakness? Morrison needs all the land in the valley to make his plan work. If even 1 or 2 of us refuse to sell and can prove he's been using illegal methods to force people out. Daniel paused. Tom thinks the territorial government in Austin might be very interested in hearing about a man who's been burning barns and threatening families. Margaret considered this. But we'd need proof. We'd need evidence. And we'd need to work together instead of trying to fight him alone. Daniel struggled to sit up straighter. Margaret, what if there was a way to protect the Meadows family and stop Morrison at the same time? What are you thinking? I'm thinking that maybe it's time for all the small ranchers in this valley to stand together. Pool our resources, share information, watch each other's backs. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he spoke. And I'm thinking that a certain brave woman who's not afraid to face down bullies might be exactly what we need to help organize such an effort. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. You want me to help coordinate some kind of alliance between the ranchers? I want you to help save this valley and everyone in it, including yourself. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both tense. Through the window, she could see a group of riders coming up the lane, but this time, instead of Morrison's men, she recognized Sheriff Bradley leading several deputies. Looks like word about the fire has spread, Daniel observed. Margaret stood up as the sheriff dismounted in the yard. Daniel, I need to think about everything you've said. But right now, I need to get back to the Meadows family and make sure they're safe. I understand. But Margaret? Daniel caught her hand as she turned to go. Whatever you decide about the job, about us, about any of it, just promise me you'll be careful. Morrison's shown he's willing to hurt people to get what he wants. Margaret squeezed his fingers gently. I promise. And Daniel, you take that laudanum Doc Peterson brought. You can't help anyone if you're too stubborn to let yourself heal. As she walked outside to meet Sheriff Bradley, Margaret's mind whirled with everything Daniel had told her. Morrison's threat was bigger than she'd realized, affecting not just one or two families but the entire future of the valley. And somehow, she'd found herself right in the middle of it all. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat as Margaret approached, his weathered face showing the strain of a man who'd been dealing with too much trouble lately. Behind him, 3 deputies sat their horses with the alert posture of men expecting danger. "Miss Hartwell, I'm glad you're here. How's Daniel doing?" "He'll recover. But it was close. Sheriff, he thinks Morrison was behind the fire." "So do I. Problem is, Morrison's smart enough not to leave evidence lying around." Bradley gestured toward the burned barn. "My deputies found traces of coal oil, but that doesn't prove who poured it. Could have been anyone." One of the younger deputies, a man Margaret didn't recognize, spoke up. "Sheriff, what if we just arrest Morrison on suspicion? Hold him long enough to ask some hard questions?" Bradley shook his head. "Can't arrest a man without proof, especially one with Morrison's connections. Word is, he's got friends in the territorial government who wouldn't appreciate us hassling him without cause." Margaret felt frustration building in her chest. So he can just keep terrorizing people with no consequences? "Not if we're smart about it." Bradley's eyes were calculating. "Miss Hartwell, I hear you've been working for the Meadows family. How are they holding up?" "They're scared, but they're not ready to give up their ranch." "Good, because I've got a proposition that might interest the man you." The sheriff glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "Morrison's been careful to hit one ranch at a time, keeping his victims isolated and afraid. But what if they weren't isolated anymore?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if all the small ranchers in this valley started working together, sharing information, watching each other's property, maybe even pooling their resources to hire extra protection?" Margaret's heart jumped. This was exactly what Daniel had suggested, but coming from the sheriff, it sounded more official, more possible. "You think that would work?" "I think Morrison's counting on people being too afraid and too proud to ask for help. Take that away from him, and his whole strategy falls apart." Bradley looked directly at Margaret. "But organizing something like that would take someone with connections to multiple families, someone folks trust, someone brave enough to ride between ranches carrying messages and coordinating plans." The implication was clear, and Margaret felt both excitement and terror at the idea. "Sheriff, are you asking me to be some kind of messenger between the ranchers?" "I'm asking you to consider it. You know the Meadows family well enough that they'd listen to you. Daniel Crawford obviously trusts you. And from what I've heard, you've got the backbone to stand up to Morrison if necessary." Margaret thought about Mrs. Meadows' tired eyes, about Billy's mischievous grin, about Daniel lying injured in his bed, asking her to help save the valley. The weight of responsibility felt heavy on her shoulders, but also strangely right. What would I need to do? Start by talking to the Meadows family about forming an alliance with their neighbors. Get them to agree to share information about Morrison's movements, coordinate watch schedules, maybe even consider moving their families together temporarily for protection. And then you visit every other small rancher in the valley and convince them to join the alliance. The Hendersons, the Martinez family, old Pete Wilson, the widow Johnson and her boy Everyone Morrison's been pressuring. Margaret's mind raced. How many families are we talking about? 8 or 9 that haven't sold out yet. If we can get them all working together. Bradley's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Morrison would have to face an organized group instead of picking off isolated targets. Margaret finished. Exactly. And if he tries anything violent against an organized group of citizens, the territorial government would have to take notice. Margaret looked back toward the house where Daniel was recovering, then at the smoking ruins of his barn. Morrison had done this to a good man simply because he wouldn't sell his land. How many other families would suffer if someone didn't stand up to him? "I'll do it," she said quietly. Bradley's face showed relief and respect in equal measure. "I was hoping you'd say that. But Miss Hartwell, I need you to understand the risks. If Morrison figures out what you're doing, He'll come after me the same way he came after Daniel. Maybe worse. You'd be the one thing standing between him and everything he wants. Margaret squared her shoulders. Then we'd better make sure the alliance is strong enough to protect all of us. One of the deputies rode up closer. Sheriff, we've got company coming. Margaret turned to see a familiar wagon approaching from the direction of Creek Ranch. Her heart sank as she recognized Mrs. Meadows driving, with Jake beside her and all 4 younger children crowded in the wagon bed. What are they doing here? She wondered aloud. The wagon pulled up in the yard, and Mrs. Meadows climbed down with a grim expression. Margaret, thank goodness you're safe. We came as soon as we heard about the fire. You shouldn't have brought the children. If Morrison's men are still around. Morrison's men came to our ranch an hour after you left, Jake interrupted. His face flushed with anger. 3 of them this time, and they weren't being polite about their threats. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. What kind of threats? Mrs. Meadows looked around at the group of lawmen, then at Margaret. They said accidents tend to happen to families who employ troublemakers. Said it might be safer for everyone if we let our housekeeper go and reconsidered Mr. Morrison's generous offer to buy our land. Margaret felt ice-cold fury spread through her veins. Morrison wasn't just threatening the ranchers, was threatening anyone who tried to help them. They specifically mentioned me? By name, Mrs. Meadows confirmed. Said you'd been asking too many questions and stirring up trouble among the neighbors. Sheriff Bradley exchanged glances with his deputies. Sounds like Morrison's getting desperate. That might work in our favor. How? Jake demanded. Desperate men make mistakes, and threatening women and children in front of witnesses is the kind of mistake that even Morrison's friends in the territorial government won't be able to ignore. Margaret looked at the Meadows family, Mrs. Meadows trying to look brave despite her obvious fear, Jake angry and frustrated at being unable to protect his family, the younger children sensing the tension without understanding it. These people had given her a job when she needed one, and now they were in danger partly because of their association with her. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the safe choice isn't the right choice at all. Mrs. Meadows, Margaret said carefully, how would you feel about temporarily moving your family somewhere safer while we deal with Morrison? You mean abandon our ranch? I mean join with other families in a place where you can all protect each other. A place where Morrison can't pick you off one by one. Mrs. Meadows looked at her husband, who had remained silent during the conversation. Mr. Meadows studied Margaret's face, then nodded slowly. You're talking about some kind of alliance. I'm talking about the only way to stop Morrison without more people getting hurt. Margaret gestured toward the burned barn. He's shown what he's willing to do to isolated targets. But if all the threatened families work together, we might actually have a chance, Mr. Meadows finished thoughtfully. Billy chose that moment to climb down from the wagon and tug on Margaret's skirt. Miss Margaret, are we going to fight the bad men like in Jake's stories? Margaret knelt down to Billy's eye level, seeing the mix of excitement and fear in his young face. Behind him, the twins and Mary watched with wide eyes, while baby Samuel slept peacefully in Mrs. Meadows' arms. We're going to be smart and brave, just like in the best stories, she told him, and we're going to make sure all the good families can stay safe on their ranches. Promise? Margaret looked up at the circle of faces around Hearth Meadows' family, Sheriff Bradley and his deputies, and through the window, Daniel watching from his bed. Each person represented someone counting on her to help find a solution to Morrison's threats. I promise we're going to try our very best. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret wondered if their very best would be enough to stop a man with Morrison's resources and ruthlessness. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the margin for error had gotten smaller. The real battle for the valley was about to begin. Margaret's horse stumbled on the rocky trail, jolting her back to alertness as she rode toward the Henderson Ranch at sunset. She'd been visiting threatened families all day, and her saddlebags bulged with hastily written notes and promises of support. 4 ranchers had already agreed to join the alliance, but the Hendersons were known for keeping to themselves, and they controlled the largest water source in the valley after Morrison's holdings. The Henderson place sat in a natural bowl surrounded by hills, making it easy to defend but also easy to trap. As Margaret crested the final ridge, She saw smoke rising from multiple buildings, and her blood ran cold. But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't the black smoke of destruction, it was the gray smoke of cooking fires and forge work. "Hold it right there," a voice called from behind a boulder. Margaret reined in her horse, hands raised to show she meant no harm. A teenage boy emerged from cover, rifle in hand, but pointed toward the ground. "I'm Margaret Hartwell," she called. "I work for the Meadows family. I need to speak with your father about Morrison." The boy studied her suspiciously. "How do we know you're not working for Morrison?" "Because if I was working for Morrison, I'd already own this valley." Margaret kept her voice calm and reasonable. "Your father will want to hear what I have to say." After a tense moment, the boy nodded toward the ranch buildings. "Follow me, but keep your hands where I can see them." As they rode into the yard, Margaret was impressed by what she saw. The Henderson Ranch was built like a fortress, with the main house, bunkhouse, and barn arranged in a square around a central courtyard. Men with rifles watched from the rooftops, and she counted at least a dozen horses in the corral, far more than a typical family ranch would need. Frank Henderson emerged from the house as they approached. He was a big man with steel gray hair and hands like ham hocks, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Miss Hartwell, heard you've been making the rounds today." Henderson's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Also heard Morrison's men paid you a visit at the Meadows place." "News travels fast." "Bad news always does. What brings you to my ranch?" Margaret dismounted and straightened her shoulders. This was her most important conversation of the day. If she could convince Henderson to join the alliance, the other holdouts would follow. "Mr. Henderson, how many of your neighbors have sold out to Morrison in the past 6 months?" "Too many." "And how many more do you think will sell before winter if Morrison keeps burning barns and threatening families?" Henderson's jaw tightened. "What's your point, Miss Hartwell?" "My point is that Morrison's strategy is working because he's picking us off one at a time. But what if we stopped fighting alone and started fighting together?" "Together how?" Margaret pulled a folded paper from her saddlebag. "Sheriff Bradley is organizing an alliance of all the remaining small ranchers. Shared information, coordinated patrols, mutual protection, maybe even a common defense fund to hire additional security." Henderson studied the paper, his expression unreadable. "Says here you're asking families to temporarily relocate to central locations for safety. Only until we can prove Morrison's using illegal methods and get the territorial government involved." "And you think the government will care about a few small ranchers?" Margaret met his gaze directly. "I think the government will care about a man who's terrorizing entire communities to steal their land, especially if we can provide evidence." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, looking around at his fortified ranch. "Miss Hartwell, you see how I've prepared this place. My family can hold out here for months if necessary. Against Morrison's men, maybe. But what about when winter comes and you need supplies from town? What about when your cattle need to move to different pastures? What about when your children need schooling or medical care? We'll manage." "Will you?" "Because Morrison doesn't just have hired guns, she has money, political connections, and patience. He can wait you out, cut off your supply lines, turn the whole territory against you if necessary." Margaret stepped closer. "Mr. Henderson, you're a smart man. You know you can't win this fight alone." Henderson's son approached from the barn, and Margaret was surprised to see he was older than she'd first thought, probably 17 or 18, with his father's broad shoulders and steady gaze. "Pa, what if she's right?" the young man said. "What if we joined up with the others, pooled our resources? We've got the best water rights in the valley. That gives us leverage." "Michael, this isn't your decision to make." "Maybe it should be." Michael's voice was respectful but firm. "I'm the one who'll inherit this ranch someday. Shouldn't I have a say in whether there's anything left to inherit?" Henderson looked between his son and Margaret, clearly wrestling with the decision. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Tomorrow morning, all the Alliance families are meeting at the Double Creek Ranch to plan our strategy. Daniel Crawford's place is central, defensible, and Morrison's already shown his hand there." Margaret paused. "We'd like you and your family to be part of that meeting. And if we decide not to join, then you fight Morrison alone and pray you're strong enough to last until he moves on to easier targets." Henderson walked to the edge of his porch and stared out at the valley below. Margaret could see other ranches in the distance, some still showing lights in their windows, others dark and abandoned. "How many families have you signed up so far?" "6, including the Meadows family. With you, that would be 7 out of the 9 remaining independent ranchers. 7 families against Morrison and his backers." Henderson shook his head. "Those aren't great odds. They're better odds than any of us have alone." Michael stepped forward. "Pa, remember what Grandpa used to say about the war? Sometimes you have to choose between a dangerous fight and certain defeat." Henderson smiled slightly at his son's words. "Your grandfather was a wise man, also a stubborn one who got himself killed charging a Confederate cannon. But he died fighting for something he believed in," Michael replied quietly. Margaret held her breath as Henderson considered his options. She could see the internal struggle playing out on his weathered features, the desire to protect his family warring with the knowledge that isolation might not be protection at all. Finally, Henderson turned back to Margaret. "Miss Hartwell, I'll make you a deal. I'll come to your meeting tomorrow, hear what you all have to say. But I'm not committing to anything until I know exactly what you're asking of my family." Relief flooded through Margaret's chest. "That's all I'm asking, that you listen with an open mind." "I can do that much." Henderson extended his hand. "But, Miss Hartwell, if this alliance of yours falls apart and leaves my family exposed to Morrison's revenge—" "It won't," Margaret said firmly, shaking his hand. "We're stronger together than apart. Tomorrow, you'll see that for yourself." As Margaret rode away from the Henderson ranch, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. She'd accomplished more than she'd hoped for today, but she also knew the real test was still ahead. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether they could forge a real alliance or whether Morrison would pick them off one by one while they argued among themselves. Either way, there was no turning back now. The sun was barely up when wagons and riders began arriving at the Double Creek Ranch, but Margaret had been awake for hours, pacing Daniel's kitchen and worrying about everything that could go wrong. Daniel sat at his table with his injured leg propped up, watching her wear a path in his wooden floor. "You're going to wear a hole clear through to China if you keep that up," he observed. "What if they don't get along? What if Henderson changes his mind? What if Morrison's men attack while we're all gathered in one place?" Margaret paused in her pacing to look out the window. What if this whole idea is a terrible mistake? "Margaret, come here." She walked over to Daniel's chair, and he reached up to take her hands in his bandaged ones. "Yesterday, you convinced 6 families to risk everything on a plan that didn't exist 24 hours ago. You rode alone across dangerous territory to organize people who barely knew each other. You stood up to Morrison's threats and Sheriff Bradley's doubts." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "Today, you're going to finish what you started." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both look toward the window. Frank Henderson rode into the yard with his son Michael and 2 other men Margaret didn't recognize. Behind them came the Martinez family in a loaded wagon, followed by old Pete Wilson on his mule. "Looks like your meeting is about to begin," Daniel said. Margaret squeezed his hands once, then went outside to greet the arriving families. The Meadows clan had spent the night at Daniel's place for safety, and now Jake was helping his father unhitch their horses, while the younger children played in the yard under their mother's watchful eye. Sheriff Bradley arrived with 2 deputies just as the widow Johnson and her twin sons rode up. Margaret counted heads quickly. Every family she'd visited yesterday had come, plus a few extra hands for protection. "All right, everyone," she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Let's gather on the porch where we can all hear each other." The next hour was organized chaos. Each family had brought different concerns, different resources, and different ideas about how to deal with Morrison. Henderson wanted to focus on armed defense. The Martinez family suggested appealing directly to the territorial governor. Mrs. Johnson thought they should pool their money and hire a lawyer from Austin. "We're talking past each other," Michael Henderson said finally, standing up from his seat on the porch steps. "Before we decide how to fight Morrison, shouldn't we figure out exactly what we're fighting for?" Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for the young man's clear thinking. Michael's right. Let's start with what we all want. I want my children to grow up on the land their grandfather settled, Mrs. Meadows said simply. I want Morrison to pay for what he did to Daniel's barn, Jake added, his face flushed with anger. Old Pete Wilson spat tobacco juice over the porch rail. I want that snake Morrison to choke on his own greed. I want my boys to have a future that doesn't involve running from bullies, Mrs. Johnson said quietly. One by one, each family shared their hopes and fears. Margaret listened carefully, looking for the common threads that could bind them together. So, we all want the same basic things, she said when everyone had spoken. The right to keep our land, protection for our families, and justice for Morrison's crimes. Frank Henderson nodded slowly. Put that way, it sounds reasonable. Question is, how do we achieve those goals without getting ourselves killed in the process? Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. That's where the law comes in. I've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office in Austin. They're very interested in Morrison's activities, but they need evidence of specific crimes. What kind of evidence? Asked Carlos Martinez. Witnesses to arson, threats, cattle theft, documentation of Morrison's attempts to force land sales through intimidation. Bradley pulled out a leather folder. I've got sworn statements from 3 families who've already sold out, testifying that Morrison threatened them with violence if they didn't accept his offers. Margaret felt her heart jump. That's proof of coercion. It's a start, but we need more. Recent incidents, multiple witnesses, maybe even catching Morrison's men in the act of sabotage. You want us to be bait, Henderson said grimly. I want you to be prepared. Morrison's going to escalate his tactics now that he knows you're working together. When he does, we need to be ready to document everything. Mrs. Johnson raised her hand tentatively. Sheriff, what if some of us aren't comfortable with that level of risk? I have young children to think about. Which is why we're proposing a 2-part strategy, Margaret said, an idea forming in her mind. Some families relocate temporarily to the most defensible locations, Henderson's place, here at Daniel's ranch, maybe the Martinez farm with its stone buildings. The others go to town for safety while we gather evidence. Split up the alliance? Michael Henderson asked. Protect the families while keeping the ranches operational, Margaret corrected. Morrison can't steal what he can't control, and he can't control properties that are actively defended. Carlos Martinez stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. My stone house could shelter 2 families easily, and we have good sight lines across the valley from our ridge. My place is built like a fort, Henderson added grudgingly. Could handle 3 or 4 families if we doubled up. And I'm not going anywhere, Daniel said firmly from his chair by the door. This is my land, and I'll defend it broken leg or not. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at the determination in his voice. So we establish 3 defensive positions, coordinate patrols between them, and make sure Morrison knows we're watching his every move. What about supplies? Communication? Mrs. Meadows asked. We set up a rotation. Jake and Michael are both good riders. They could carry messages between locations. For supplies, we pool our resources and make group runs to town with armed escorts. Sheriff Bradley nodded approvingly. It's a solid plan, but remember, the goal isn't to start a war with Morrisonites to gather enough evidence to end this legally. Old Pete Wilson cackled. Speak for yourself, Sheriff. I've been itching for a fight with that snake since he first showed his face in this valley. Pete, if we handle this right, we won't need to fight, Margaret said. We'll let Morrison defeat himself. How's that? Margaret looked around at the circle of determined faces. Morrison's used to dealing with scared, isolated families. He's not prepared for organized resistance. When he realizes his usual tactics aren't working, he'll get desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. Big mistakes, Daniel added with a grim smile. Henderson stood up and extended his hand to Margaret. Miss Hartwell, you've got yourself an alliance. When do we start? We already have, Margaret replied, shaking his hand firmly. Morrison just doesn't know it yet. As the families began making specific plans for the move to defensive positions, Margaret felt a mixture of pride and terror at what they were attempting. They were David facing Goliath, but instead of one small stone, they had the combined courage of people fighting for their homes. The question was whether that would be enough when Morrison discovered what they were doing. Margaret's eyes snapped open to the sound of gunshots echoing across the valley like thunder on a clear night. She rolled out of her bedroll on Daniel's kitchen floor, her heart hammering as more shots rang out from the direction of Henderson's ranch. Through the window, she could see orange flames flickering against the dark sky 3 miles away. "Daniel," she called, rushing to his bedroom. "Something's happening at Henderson's place." Daniel was already awake, struggling to get his splinted leg out of bed. "Help me up. We need to see what's going on." Margaret supported his weight as they made their way to the front porch. In the distance, the orange glow was growing brighter, and the sound of shouting carried on the night wind. Jake Meadows came running from the barn where he'd been sleeping with the horses. "Miss Margaret, should I ride over and help them?" "No." Daniel grabbed the boy's arm. "This could be exactly what Morrison wants to draw us out of our defensive positions and pick us off one by one." Margaret's mind raced. 3 days had passed since they'd established their alliance, and Morrison had been ominously quiet. Too quiet, she'd thought. Now it seemed like he was making his move. "We need to signal the Martinez family," she said. "Let them know we're aware of the attack but staying put." Daniel pointed toward the ridge where the Martinez ranch sat. "There Carlos is already signaling back." Margaret could see a lantern being waved in a pattern they'd agreed upon. 3 long sweeps meant under attack but holding position. But even as she watched, the light began moving erratically, then disappeared entirely. "That's not good," Jake said quietly. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. But instead of Morrison's men, Margaret recognized the voice of young Michael Henderson calling out from the darkness. "Don't shoot. It's Michael Henderson and my brother Tom." 2 riders materialized out of the shadows, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothes singed with smoke. Michael's face was streaked with soot, and his younger brother Tom was clutching his left arm. "What happened?" Margaret demanded as the boys dismounted. "Morrison hit us with at least a dozen men," Michael gasped, trying to catch his breath. "They set fire to our hay barn and tried to stampede our cattle. Pa and the other men are fighting them off, but they sent me to warn you." "Warn us about what?" "This is just the beginning. We captured one of Morrison's men, and before he got away, he said they're hitting all 3 defensive positions tonight." Daniel cursed under his breath. "Divide and conquer. Force us to choose between helping each other and defending our own positions." "We can't abandon our people," Margaret said firmly. "Jake, saddle the fastest horses. We're riding to help the Martinez family." "Margaret, no," Daniel protested. "If Morrison's men are moving between positions, you could ride straight into an ambush. And if we don't help Carlos and his family, they could be slaughtered." Margaret was already moving toward the barn. "You stay here with Tom and the younger children. Jake and Michael, you're with me." As Margaret saddled her horse, her hands shook with a mixture of fear and determination. This was the moment she'd been dreading when the alliance would be tested by real violence. But there was no choice. The Martinez family had 2 elderly grandparents and 3 small children. They couldn't defend themselves against a dozen armed men. The ride to the Martinez ranch took 20 minutes across rough terrain, with Margaret leading Jake and Michael through gullies and behind hills to avoid being spotted. As they approached the stone house, Margaret could see why the signal light had disappeared. The front of the building was under siege. Morrison's men had taken cover behind rocks and trees, firing at the house while several others tried to set fire to the outbuildings. The Martinez family was shooting back from the windows, but they were clearly outnumbered. "We need to get behind them," Margaret whispered to the boys. "Circle around through that grove of trees and attack from their blind side." "What about you?" Michael asked. "I'm going to create a distraction." Margaret checked the rifle Jake had insisted she carry. "Give me 5 minutes, then hit them hard and fast." Margaret worked her way around to the back of the Martinez house, using shadows and brush for cover. Her plan was simple, but dangerous. If she could get close enough to the house, she could signal Carlos about the boys' position and coordinate a joint attack. But as she crept closer, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Morrison's voice, calm and confident as he directed his men. "Burn the stable first, then the smokehouse. When they run out of ammunition, We'll offer them one last chance to sign the deed over peacefully. Margaret realized Morrison wasn't just attacking, he was trying to force the Martinez family to surrender their land tonight, while the alliance was scattered and confused. She had to act fast. Margaret found a loose stone and hurled it at the kitchen window of the house. When Carlos appeared, she used hand signals they'd practiced to indicate the number of attackers and the boy's position. Carlos nodded and disappeared from the window. Moments later, Jake and Michael's rifles opened fire from the tree line, catching Morrison's men by surprise. At the same time, Carlos and his older sons began shooting from new positions in the house, creating crossfire that forced the attackers to scramble for better cover. "Fall back!" Morrison shouted. "This isn't over." But as his men began retreating, Margaret realized she was trapped between them and the house. She pressed herself against the stone wall, hoping the darkness would hide her. That's when she came face to face with Morrison himself. "Well, well," he said softly, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. "The little housekeeper who's been causing me so much trouble." Margaret's hand moved toward her rifle, but Morrison was faster. His gun was already pointed at her chest. "I don't think so, Miss Hartwell. You and I need to have a conversation." "Drop the rifle and step away from the wall," Morrison commanded, his voice deadly calm despite the gunfire echoing around them. Margaret could see his eyes clearly in the moonlight, cold and calculating, like a snake deciding whether to strike. Margaret let the rifle fall to the ground, but kept her chin raised defiantly. "If you're planning to shoot me, you'd better do it quickly. My friends know where I am." "Oh, I'm not going to shoot you. You're much more valuable to me alive." Morrison gestured with his gun toward the open ground, away from the house. "You're going to help me end this little rebellion of yours before more people get hurt. I'll never help you steal these people's land." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Miss Hartwell, you misunderstand the situation. I don't need to steal anything. I'm offering to buy these ranches at fair market prices. It's not my fault if some folks are too stubborn to accept reasonable offers. Reasonable offers backed up by arson and threats. Accidents happen in ranch country, especially to people who make enemies of the wrong men." Morrison's voice hardened. "But you can prevent more accidents, Miss Hartwell. All you have to do is convince your alliance friends to be sensible." Margaret heard the gunfire beginning to die down as Morrison's men retreated into the darkness. Carlos and his family had managed to drive off the attack, but she knew Morrison would be back with more men and a different strategy. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, stalling for time. "Simple. You go back to your friends and explain that resistance is futile. Tell them about the territorial officials who've already agreed to support my development plans. Tell them about the railroad company that wants to run tracks through this valley. Tell them about the cattle buyers from Chicago who are willing to pay premium prices for beef raised on Morrison land." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You've already bought off the territorial government?" "Let's just say I have friends in high places who understand the benefits of progress." Morrison's smile was triumphant. "Your Sheriff Bradley thinks he can appeal to Austin for help, but he doesn't realize that Austin wants this valley developed just as much as I do." "You're lying." "Am I? Tell me, Miss Hartwell, why do you think it's taken so long for the territorial marshal to respond to Bradley's requests for help? Why do you think no federal investigators have shown up to look into these alleged crimes?" Margaret's mind raced. Sheriff Bradley had been confident that help was coming from Austin, but now that she thought about it, all his communications had been one way. Requests for assistance that went unanswered, reports that disappeared into bureaucratic silence. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything," she said firmly. "These families won't give up their land. They will when they realize they have no choice." Morrison stepped closer, and Margaret could smell whiskey on his breath. "Tonight was just a warning, Miss Hartwell. Next time, I won't be so gentle. Next time, we'll be ready for you." "Will you? Because next time, I won't just be targeting your little alliance. Next time, I'll be targeting the things you care about most." Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "Starting with that injured rancher you're so fond of." Margaret felt rage surge through her like fire. "If you touch Daniel..." "You'll what? Organize another meeting?" Write another strongly worded letter to Austin? Morrison laughed again. Miss Hartwell, you're a brave woman, but you're fighting forces much larger than yourself. That's when Margaret heard it. The sound of horses approaching fast from multiple directions. Morrison heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound. Boss, one of his men called from the darkness. We've got company coming from 3 directions. Margaret's heart soared as she recognized the voices calling out battle cries in the night. Henderson's men approaching from the north, Daniel's group from the east, and what sounded like Sheriff Bradley's deputies from the south. Impossible, Morrison snarled. My men are keeping them pinned down at their own ranches. Maybe your men aren't as good as you thought, Margaret said with satisfaction. Morrison's face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, Jake Meadows appeared around the corner of the house with his rifle trained on Morrison's back. Drop your gun, mister, Jake said in a voice that was trying hard to sound grown-up. You're surrounded. For a moment, Morrison looked like he might try to shoot his way out, but then the sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Margaret could see torchlights converging on the Martinez ranch from all directions. Morrison lowered his weapon and smiled coldly. This isn't over, Miss Hartwell. I have resources you can't imagine and patience you can't match. Maybe, Margaret replied, but tonight you lost. Sheriff Bradley's voice rang out across the yard. Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the sheriff and his deputies surrounded Morrison, Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. But even as they put handcuffs on Morrison's wrists, she could see the confidence in his eyes hadn't dimmed. He still believed he would win in the end. Daniel appeared at Margaret's side, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch but grinning with pride. Are you hurt? I'm fine. But Daniel, Morrison says he has friends in the territorial government. Says they want this valley developed regardless of what we want. Daniel's expression grew serious. Then we'll have to make sure the right people hear our side of the story. Frank Henderson approached, his clothes torn and his face grim. We drove off his men, but they'll be back, and next time, they'll come with even more force. Margaret looked around at the faces of her friends, dirty, tired, but determined. They'd won tonight's battle, but the war was far from over. Then we'd better be ready for them, she said quietly. As dawn began to break over the valley, Margaret realized that everything was about to change. Morrison's arrest would only make his backers more desperate, and desperate people with money and political connections were dangerous in ways that simple hired guns could never be. The real fight for the valley was just beginning. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the garden behind Daniel's house, their house, now watching the late summer vegetables grow in neat rows that stretched toward the rebuilt barn. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the yard as Billy Meadows taught baby Elizabeth how to stack blocks, while the twins chased chickens and Mary picked wildflowers for the kitchen table. Daniel emerged from the barn, walking without his crutch for the first time in months. Their 6-month-old daughter slept peacefully in his arms, her tiny fist curled around his finger. Little Elizabeth had her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle eyes, and she was already the light of their lives. She's getting heavy, Daniel said, settling beside Margaret on the porch swing he'd built for her birthday. She's perfect, Margaret replied, stroking the baby's soft cheek. Just like her mother. Margaret leaned into her husband's embrace, marveling at how much had changed since that first day she'd shown up at the wrong ranch. The territorial marshal had finally arrived from Austin to help Morrison, but to arrest him on federal charges of mail fraud and conspiracy. It turned out that Sheriff Bradley's letters had been reaching the right people after all. They'd just been building a case carefully before taking action. Morrison was now serving 10 years in federal prison, and his eastern backers had quietly withdrawn from Texas when their illegal activities became public knowledge. The Valley ranchers had not only kept their land, but had formed a permanent cooperative that made them stronger than any of them could have been alone. Mrs. Henderson stopped by this morning, Margaret said. Michael's engagement to the Martinez girl is official. They're planning a spring wedding. Young love, Daniel observed with a smile. Think they'll be as happy as we are? I hope so, though I doubt any couple could be as lucky as we've been. The sound of approaching horses made them both look toward the road, but instead of bringing trouble, the riders brought joy. Jake Meadows, now 16 and tall as a man, rode up with a letter in his hand and a grin on his face. "Miss Margaret, Mr. Daniel, I got accepted to the Teachers' College in Austin." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. Jake had been working toward this goal for months, determined to get an education that would help him serve his community better. "That's wonderful news, Jake. When do you start?" "Next month, but I'll be back for Christmas, and every summer to help Pa with the ranch." Jake's expression grew serious. "I owe it all to you, Miss Margaret. If you hadn't shown us how to stand up for ourselves, I never would have believed I could amount to anything. You would have found your way, Jake. You just needed someone to believe in you." Mrs. Meadows appeared in the yard, having walked over from Creek Ranch with baby Samuel toddling beside her. The Meadows family had decided to stay in their original home once Morrison was defeated, but they remained close neighbors and even closer friends. "Margaret, I have news," Mrs. Meadows announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "The territorial governor wants to meet with our cooperative. He's thinking of using our alliance as a model for other communities facing similar problems." Margaret felt a flutter of the old excitement she'd experienced when organizing the Ranchers Alliance. "When?" "Next month in Austin. He specifically requested that you and Daniel represent our group." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "Us? Why us?" "Because you two are the heart of what we've built here," Mrs. Meadows said simply. "Margaret organized us, and Daniel's ranch became our center. Together, you proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together." As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors stopped by to share news and visit. The Henderson family brought fresh bread. The Martinez clan contributed a pot of their famous stew, and even old Pete Wilson showed up with a jug of his homemade cider. They all gathered on Daniel's front porch as the sun began to set, sharing food and stories and plans for the future. Margaret looked around at the faces of these people who had become her family, not just Daniel and baby Elizabeth, but the entire community they'd fought to protect. "You know," Daniel said quietly as the evening stars began to appear, "I used to think this house was too small for all my dreams. And now I realize it was never about the size of the house. It was about the size of the love inside it." Margaret smiled, remembering the scared, desperate woman who had stumbled off the stagecoach at the wrong ranch over a year ago. That woman had been looking for work and a place to hide from her failures. Instead, she'd found a purpose, a community, and a love deeper than anything she'd ever imagined. "Daniel," she said softly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten off at the right ranch that first day?" "Every day," Daniel replied, pulling her closer. "And every day, I thank God you didn't." As the evening deepened and their friends began heading home to their own families, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd set out looking for $20 a month and a place to belong. Instead, she discovered that home wasn't a place you found, it was something you built with the people you loved. The wrong ranch had led her to exactly the right life.